Hello and welcome back to The Determinants of Health. In this lecture, we're going to explore something that's in my field of research, that is international development and health, and a particularly important policy development around the funding and programming of international development and health that we call the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs for short. And yes, I'm having a bad hair day, so please ignore the little face in the lower right-hand corner and focus on the glory that are these slides. So our story begins with something called the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals. So back in 2000, representatives of 189 countries from the UN met in something called the Millennium Summit. And there they agreed to seek out or to declare that there were going to be a set of goals that would direct how we wished to remake the world in a positive capacity. What they landed upon were essentially a declaration that there were 8 specific goals formulated as 21 specific targets, and each target has a series of indicators that we use to measure whether or not that target is achieved, a total of 60 indicators for these 21 targets. And they call these 8 goals the Millennium Development Goals. These were endorsed, but they are not exactly binding. So you need to understand that just because the United Nations countries agree on something, it's not technically a binding law. It's a gentleman's agreement, where we say that these are the guideposts, the guidelines that will help us determine how best to proceed in funding the world's development projects. Okay, so the Millennium Development Goals for the next 15 years became the guidepost for all high-level development funding around development and particularly health. Keep in mind, though, that the process started 10 years earlier in 1990. So all of the baseline data, when we had baseline data, begins in 1990. So when the MDGs expired in 2015, that was a 25-year process that allowed us to determine whether or not a directed global effort could result in dramatic change in the world over 25 years. These were the 9 goals. Okay, and these 9 goals were essentially created by a small team of experts funded by the United Nations, and there wasn't a whole lot of interference from special interest groups, advocacy groups, and people like that. It was a small group of individuals who thought they understood how best to do this sort of thing. What were those goals? Well, they were to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Sounds great, right? As we covered in a previous lecture, how you define poverty matters, and eradication is a fairly ambitious goal to have. So maybe eradication isn't an appropriate way to go. Maybe we need to reduce it by a certain amount. We want to achieve universal primary education. What does that even mean? Does that mean formal education? Does that mean, does that include being educated at home? Does that include advanced mathematical thinking, or just the very basics of literacy and numeracy? That's going to vary from culture to culture. Anyway, you start to see the problems of how to operationalize these goals. Number 3, promote gender equality. Okay, in what sense? In the household, governmentally, in business, all of the above? Number 4, reduce child mortality. Great, that was easily measurable. How many kids are dying now? Let's get that number down. Number 5, improve maternal health. Okay, there are some key ways of measuring maternal health, looking at the maternal mortality ratio, the number of women who die in childbirth. That's easily measured, at least. Number 6, combat HIV/AIDS and the other big infectious diseases. Great. Number 7, ensure environmental sustainability. Okay, as you can probably tell, that one was going to be problematic in terms of politics and procedures. And number 8, develop a global partnership for development. What does that mean? Well, that has to do with funding these things, how we fund it, who's paying for it all, who's involved. So the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were a kind of social compact or social contract where all the great powers of the world entered into a gentleman's agreement, as we say. we agree that we will direct all our large-scale funding towards achieving these goals in some capacity. Okay, so the accountability is that the people receiving the money, the developing countries, the poor countries, are accountable for striving to achieve these outcomes, to reduce poverty levels, to reduce child mortality levels, whereas the rich countries, the ones who are giving the money, are accountable for providing the means of support, of donating money, of upping their charitable giving. Okay, so we call charitable giving ODA when it's given by government. ODA stands for Official Development Assistance, and that's different from the amount of money that you and I give to a charity. Like if we sign a check over to the Red Cross or your church charity group, that isn't included in how we measure ODA. ODA is the amount of money given by a government officially, either to another government or through a third party like the World Bank. Don't worry too much about that. That's not a focus of this course, but I want you to understand what some of these words mean. Right? So, as a result, a majority of the world's poor countries, are motivated to adopt these development strategies around these 8 goals. Were they too ambitious? Okay, so to eliminate poverty, well, that's fairly ambitious. At the global level, the idea was to set them to be not too ambitious. I think a more realistic goal was to reduce poverty levels by half or something like that. And it's from a 25-year period. And so they were set to be relevant or relative to the baseline at 1990. Very few people, in my opinion, actually expected us to achieve these goals. They were more an expression of how we thought the world should be come 2015. And here we are in 2017. We can actually look at whether or not they succeeded. Right? So you can Google, were the MDGs successful, and you find all sorts of articles about this. Here, this article here says, were the Millennium Development Goals a success? Yes, sort of. Sort of. Yeah. Some ways they were, in some ways they weren't. So goal 1 was to eradicate extreme poverty. This graph shows us in the blue where we started out in terms of the number of people living beneath the global poverty line of $1.25 a day. We started out pretty high, and we came down universally across the world, with the biggest drops in South Asia and Southeast Asia. What's the story there? Well, that's the miracle of India and China. The economic miracles of India and China. So right away you start to see that 2 countries in particular are deriving these directional improvements that we see globally. This is another graph showing us the changes that were made. So went from 47% of the world living in poverty to 14% of the world. So improvements were made. Goal number 2, to achieve a universal primary school education. So how many people are enrolled in school? How many children are enrolled in school? So the blue is before, the gray is after. Globally, there seems to be an increase as well, with Central Asia and Latin America showing no changes whatsoever. That's good. The same data shown globally. So in 2000, 100 million kids were out of school. In 2015, it's down to 57 million kids. Promote gender equality. How do you measure gender equality? Well, here's one measurement. The percent of women that are in parliaments around the world, in government around the world. So North Africa went from 3% to 24%. Huge jump. Sub-Saharan Africa, 13% to 23%. Huge jump. So it appears that according to this metric at least, there have been dramatic changes in gender equality. Maybe not in terms of income, maybe not in terms of economic opportunity, maybe not in terms of domestic violence. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But these data only show the percent of women in parliament. Okay. This data shows us the school enrollment for boys versus girls going from 1990 to 2015. And again, the girls have really upped their game. Child mortality. Similarly, child mortality has come down dramatically around the world. Biggest gains in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. This is the story of India. This is the story of all the anti-poverty and anti-HIV endeavors happening. So that's great news. Number of deaths of children under 5. That's child mortality. It went from 12.7 million in 1990 to 6 million in 2015. Essentially halved. Right? Great improvement. Improved maternal health. We'll measure this with the maternal mortality ratio, which is a ratio of the number of women who die divided by the total number of live births in the world. And we see the biggest gap is in sub-Saharan Africa. Great news. So same data shown globally. MMR is dropping significantly. Great news. Goal 6, combat HIV, malaria, and other diseases. So this graph shows us the HIV incidence rate around the world. Now, if you don't know, most HIV/AIDS cases are in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've seen that's dropped, well, according to this graph, dramatically, right, in that time period. So we're doing something right. And again, same data shown globally. New HIV infections went from 3.5 million down to 2.1 million. So we're making progress on that front. How are we making progress? Well, the number of people getting treatment went from 0.8 million to 13.6 million. So we've upped our game where it comes to actually delivering the medicines where they matter. So think now about the determinants of health again. One of the determinants of health is access to services, which is gated by education, disability status, income, all that great stuff. Right? So in addressing those determinants, we have managed to increase the distribution of antiretroviral therapies. Number 7, to ensure environmental sustainability. How can we measure this? Well, one way is to look at the emissions of carbon dioxide. This has gone up. So we've actually gone backwards with goal 7. And some people would argue that this is the most important goal, with climate change being the singular apocalyptic event that will affect your adult lives going forward. Why has it gone up? Well, if you stop and think about how we've addressed the other goals, how have we addressed poverty? How have we addressed education? How have we addressed equity amongst the genders? We've done so by improving economic activity. Improving economic activity means burning fuel. It means greater city densities. It means more driving. It means more consumption of oil and coal. In other words, to achieve the other goals, we had to burn more carbon dioxide or put more carbon into the atmosphere. So that's a challenge. How do we balance these goals that may be antithetical to each other? Another way to measure environmental sustainability is to look at people accessing water. So in 1990, 2.3 billion people had access to improved water. Today, it's 4.2 billion, a big improvement. One could argue that drilling deeper wells, accessing groundwater is contributing to environmental degradation. So there's a double-edged sword here. And the last goal, a global partnership for development. What does this mean? Well, as I mentioned, we can measure this by looking at the amount of money that rich countries give to poor countries for development purposes. And here we see that all forms of aid have increased over this period. So this bottom line shows us humanitarian aid, I believe, if I'm reading this correctly. Humanitarian aid is the amount of money we give when there are natural disasters or immediate tragedies, earthquakes and floods. That's an easy sell. Everybody agrees we need to send money now to save those people who have lava falling on them. Whereas development assistance is a little harder to justify to the taxpayer, because there you're spending money on a population maybe to build them a big dam or to invest in business training or something like that. It's more sustained. But in both cases, the numbers have gone up. Okay, and here's another way of measuring it. Global internet presence or penetration went from 6% in 2000 to 43% today. One could argue that the most important resource for the late 21st century is going to be access to information. What kind of information? Electronic information, the internet. If you don't have access to the internet, maybe you don't have access to modern living, to economic activity at a high level. So by improving people's access, we are bridging the primary digital divide, we call it. Right? The secondary digital divide is who makes the content on the internet. I'll say that again. The digital divide is the difference between people who have access to the internet versus those who don't have access to the internet. But once you get on the internet, what do you see? You see websites and content created by rich countries. So the secondary divide is the difference between those who make the content and those who do not make the content. So it's an exciting field of exploration if this interests you. if you want to build a career around filling the digital divide. Right. So that was the Millennium Development Goals. People had some problems with the MDGs. First, in many cases, there was no baseline data. So imagine a very poor country for whom we do not know how many people are impoverished. And suddenly we spend a lot of money and effort trying to reduce the poverty levels. We can't really report on how much good we did because we don't know where we began. So maybe, some people argue, we need to spend time collecting baseline data before we start messing around with development projects. Second, were the targets rational? Is it rational to say I'm going to eliminate poverty? Maybe not. Were the targets too narrow? What do I mean by that? We know from this course that the determinants of health are a variety of things that affect your behaviors and exposures. So let's say I want to improve school enrollment. What are the things I can invest in? I can invest in building more schools. I can invest in hiring more teachers. I can invest in buying more books and other products for the school. That's great. And that's an easily justifiable expense if I know my goal is to improve school attendance. However, we know in this class, one of the great barriers to people attending school is there's no road to the school. If you live in the woods and in the bush, you can't easily walk to school. That's a disincentive. Or if your parents are too poor and need you to stay home and work on their home-based business, then that's a disincentive for going to school. You can spend all the money you want on building a great school, but if you're too poor to attend that school, that's a barrier. So maybe we need a more wider definition of our goals to not just be we need to improve school attendance, to we need to improve overall development such that people can more easily attend school. See that? So how we define things matters. We need to have a more broad definition to allow the determinants of health and development to play their course. So, and lastly, we have reported on a number of successes just now, but how much of that was due to a couple of countries having economic miracles, right? India and China have had miraculous economic growth in the last 25 years. And a lot of the globe's improvements are essentially due to those two countries. So maybe we shouldn't be so proud of all the achievements we've made when it's just in really two countries. So after 2015, we had to figure out a new way to go forward. So remember, the MDGs were written by a handful of people with a set of goals in mind. But now we had a bigger inclusive project. 88 countries, groups of stakeholders, all these meetings were done. A survey was put online for citizens around the world to express what they wanted in terms of goals for development, in terms of what they saw were the problems in the world. Things around health, education, employment, the environment, government, international conflict like war, population dynamics, food, security, all this great stuff, right? So a survey was sent out as well. This went on for months, all these consultations, which were available publicly on a website, so you could watch as these consultations took place and see who was contributing to making these new goals. As a result, the world landed upon something called the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, not the MDGs, the SDGs. And the SDGs are the successor for the MDGs. The MDGs had a cutoff date of 2015. The SDGs have an intermediate date of 2030, but they're meant to take us beyond, into the century. Right? So these are the goals that are supposed to define our priorities for funding and programming as we approach the world's development and health issues. You can read about them at this link, but they are essentially 17 goals. Remember, the SDGs were just 8 goals. The SDGs are 17 goals. Remember, the MDGs had, I think, 19 targets. The SDGs have 169 targets. The MDGs had 60 indicators. The SDGs were negotiated over 2 years and have like a lot of targets, as we're going to go through in a second. So they're officially signed off on in 2015, so they are in action right now. And I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but a couple I'm going to drill down to. The first one is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Sort of similar to the first MDG, right? By the way, these slides were taken from the official SDG website, these images. And these are the targets for goal number 1. I won't go through all of these, but the first one, by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty as defined by the GPL, the Global Poverty Line of $1.25. Now, in a previous lecture, we mentioned that the global poverty line has gone up to $1.90 now. Some people say $2, but they're still using $1.25 here. 1.2, reduce by half the proportion of men, women, and children living in poverty in all its dimensions. Okay, remember that multi-dimensional poverty index? So they're being inclusive in how we define poverty here. Let's skip ahead down here. To create sound policy frameworks at the national, regional, and international levels based on pro, poor, and gender-sensitive development strategies. So they're taking consideration then the determinants of health and development, understanding that depending upon what your demographics and personal situation is, you're going to have a different experience, confrontation with poverty. Number 2, to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, etc., etc. So, here's the targets for that one. To end hunger and ensure access by all people. That's great. Okay. I'm not going to go through all of these. The point I'm trying to make here is that there are specific targets that are phrased sometimes a little vaguely. Number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. I'm not sure what that means. What does it mean to ensure healthy lives? It could mean to ensure happiness, to ensure physical activity. I'm not sure. Number 4, ensure inclusive and quality education. All right, so now it's not just about primary education, it's about all kinds of education. Number 5, again, gender equality is a big one. Number 6, access to water. Again, improved water, but also sanitation, so toilet facilities. Number 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy. That relates to the environment again. Number 8, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Okay, note that there is a caveat here for decent work. So it's not just that, hey, work in this factory in these miserable conditions and be thankful you have a salary. No, decent work that you can be proud of, that's safe, that's comfortable, that's well-paying, and that allows you to have some sort of confidence in your financial future. Number 9, build resilient infrastructure. What does that mean? I have no idea. I suspect it has to do with building opportunities for entrepreneurship or businesses and things like that. Number 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. Okay, so it's not just about that country is poor than this country, but in this country we have people who are poor and people who are rich living side by side. In fact, there's a crisis globally of the distance between the rich and the poor is widening. So this goal is meant to address that. Number 11, make cities inclusive. Okay, why is city living so important? It's important because in 2010, an important thing happened in the history of the world. For the first time ever, human beings live mostly in cities and not so much in non-cities. We have become an urban species. So it's important that we recognize that fact in how we deliver services and programmatic agendas. 12, sustainable consumption and production patterns. This has to do with, again, environmental sustainability. So there's a lot of intertwining going on. 13, take urgent action to combat the climate change and its impacts. Again, back on the environmental wagon. Here are some of the targets for the climate change goal. 13.2, to make sure that climate change measures are part of national strategies. Number 3, to improve education and awareness raising for climate change. So they're trying to make sure that the goal is interwoven in other levels of society. 14, conserve the oceans, part of the environmental mandate. 15, manage the forests. A theme is arising here. 16, promote just and peaceful, inclusive societies. Okay, this has to do with managing crime, making sure that individuals and groups aren't marginalized to the extent that they create strife and discontent. And number 17, revitalize the global partnership. That's funding again, making sure that rich countries are paying their part, making sure that a variety of institutions are involved in this process. It also adds to the idea that maybe the future is about the public-private partnerships, companies and governments and NGOs working together. So the official statement is each goal is important, which is true, and they're all connected, which is also true. Is this just for poor countries? Well, I encourage you to watch this video of Obama answering questions in Cambodia. Essentially, he says no, it's not just for poor countries. In fact, he has asked his advisors to tell him how best the SDGs can help him make policies for the United States. Obviously, this was before his presidency ended. Now we're in the Trump era and everything has changed. But the point here is that the SDGs, while targeting the majority of humanity, i.e. poor countries, is meant for everybody. So, not everyone loves them, though. It's not hard to find criticisms of the SDGs online. This one says, the SDGs should stand for senseless, dreamy, and garbled. You can read this article, this link, if you want. So, in other words, it's a lot of dreamy stuff, hippy-dippy stuff. Hey, be active. Hey, respect the environment. That's great, but how do we operationalize that definition like we did with the MDGs? Meanwhile, this article talks about how the SDGs focus on saving the world without transforming it. So there are no particularly transformative ideas in this list, just ideas around how to measure things differently. A transformative change would be rethinking what the economic model is, maybe a non-growth economy, but I'm getting off on a tangent here. This article from The Economist says that, in fact, the SDGs are worse than useless. In fact, they, in many ways, take us down the garden path towards pointless observations and non-effective strategies. And this article, same thing. It argues that maybe we're holding back progress by having dilute goals. So, let's summarize these criticisms. The MDGs are written by a small group. The SDGs are written by a committee. As a result, it's impossible to please everybody if you are making decisions in a committee. Everybody has an agenda and a point of view. You have to accommodate them all. It appears to be a political process and not really a priority-setting process. In other words, the SDGs have been criticized as being vague and aspirational rather than being operational. The targets are vague and unachievable. So remember how I said that in the MDGs, if your target is too specific, like I want to improve school attendance, that doesn't allow me to fund a program about parental employment that then frees up children to attend school. But the SDGs, being vague and aspirational, does allow that. It allows us to say, well, school attendance includes these other deterministic issues like employment, like road quality, etc. We still have the problem with lack of baseline information. So we don't know in some countries what the burden of suffering is, so we don't know if we can change that to a measurable degree. If all the targets of the SDGs are to be pursued, it's pretty expensive. We're looking at $2 to $3 trillion per year, and I'm not sure anybody can afford that. Somebody has criticized it as being a high school wish list for how to save the world. Kind of naive, sort of pointless. And then we have some internal disconnections or conflicts within the list themselves. For example, goal number 8 is all about economic growth. So improve your export economy, be more productive. All that has to do with consumption and growing your economy. But goal number 13 sort of asks for less growth, to be more constrained in how we define wealth. So the two are in opposition to each other. How do you reconcile that conflict? Some people say, though, it's wrong to compare the MDGs to the SDGs. The SDGs aren't about aid, aren't about guiding us around specific objectives. They're about agreements between governments, aspirational agreements. In fact, it's more analogous to the UN Declaration of Human Rights than they are to the MDGs. What do I mean by that? Well, the Declaration of Human Rights is simply a statement of ideals. It doesn't really carry any legal weight. In fact, there aren't a lot of specific things in the Declaration of Human Rights that we can point to say we need to achieve this, this, and this. It's more, hey, everyone's equal. That sort of important but ultimately vague statement. The same with the SDGs. It's not meant to be a guidepost for what to do as much as meant to be a statement of philosophy. So the MDGs were too narrow, and prevented donors from funding that school, or that road rather, and the parental employment, but the SDGs are flexible and allow us to do so. So, are they good or are they bad? Well, if we have global aspirations that are vague and fuzzy, then maybe people don't do anything at all. On the other hand, if they're too narrow with achievable targets, then maybe we miss out getting those targets. So we have to have a balance between the vague and the specific, and we'll have to wait and see if the SDGs actually strike that balance. I want to spend a minute talking about a study that we did, myself and a former student, Annalise Mathers. We interviewed some key informants about what they think about the SDGs, and the takeaway message there was most of them felt they were problematic. They felt that bad governance and bad taxation are in fact the real threats to progress in the world. In other words, if you have a corrupt government, you can't get anything done. And what supports a corrupt government? A bad taxation system that keeps funneling money to that bad government. So maybe the SDGs should spend more time on attacking finance and government than on these other things like environment and economic development. Also, maybe we need to focus more on specific things in each country rather than a global agenda. The last thing I want to mention is some people have suggested that maybe we need to develop new indicators. In this class so far, we've talked about many ways of measuring poverty, for example. Well, there are additional indicators we can use. Something called the poverty gap ratio. The poverty gap ratio tells us that maybe it's not sufficient to simply say this person lives beneath the poverty line, but how far beneath the poverty line, the gap between their lifestyle and sufficiency, because everyone beneath that poverty line will have a different degree of poverty. Maybe we need to measure the extent of banking services. Ever think about that? So as a determinant of health, whether or not you have a bank account is important. It determines if you can get a mortgage or a loan or some kind of credit line, if you can fund your education. Some people don't have access to a bank. Do you have access to inheritance? A lot of countries don't allow you to inherit your parents' wealth, and that's a disincentive for maybe investing in family business. And lastly, disaster risk reduction. So some places are more vulnerable to natural disasters, and perhaps we need to look at opportunities for mitigating that risk. The challenges are investing in leadership around the world, people to take on these goals as true aspirations. We need to change the focus from treatment to prevention. How do we prevent tragedies from happening? And maybe we need to look at civic engagement. So what are the various institutions that can come to play to ensure that governments actually remain accountable to following up on these goals? In summary, the SDGs were meant to replace the MDGs. The SDGs while replacing the MDGs, are more aspirational, less operational. Critics say they're too broad. Defenders say they're more inclusive. What do you think? But one thing's for sure, they are going to be the guidepost that drives funding and programming priorities for international health and development in the near future. And why it's relevant to this particular class? Well, how we think about the determinants of health are incorporated in these priorities and in the models that derive from the list of goals and aspirations that we adhere to. Thank you very much.